Imagine a pilot who stole planes from the Dutch, placed 850 caliber machine guns in the nose of a medium bomber, and transformed peaceful transport planes into flying machines of destruction. The generals said it was impossible. The engineers said the plane would never fly. But Paul "Pappy" Gunn didn't care what was impossible. His wife and 4 children were prisoners of the Japanese in Manila, and he was going to use every weapon he could find to destroy every Japanese ship between Australia and the Philippines. This is the story of the man who transformed the B-25 Mitchell into the deadliest weapon in the Pacific and changed aerial warfare forever. Paul Irvin Gunn was born on October 18, 1899, in Quitman, Arkansas, the son of a blacksmith named Nathaniel Hezekiah Gunn and Laura Litton Gunn. He was one of 6 children in a poor family who worked hard just to survive. No one in the Gunn family had any connection to aviation. No one had gone to college. But young Paul had an obsessive fascination with machines. As a teenager, Paul began reading about the fighter pilots who served in Europe during World War I. While other boys dreamed of being cowboys or ranchers, Paul dreamed of flying. On September 12, 1918, at the age of 18, he registered for the draft for World War I. A few days later, he enlisted in the United States Navy. The war ended before Paul could see combat, but he found his place in naval aviation. Initially, he served as an aviation mechanic, learning every detail about how airplanes worked. During his free time, he took flying lessons on his own, saving every penny of his military salary. Eventually, he bought his own surplus airplane and taught himself to fly, but there was a problem. Paul had left school after the 6th grade. His poor education meant he could never become a commissioned officer. And without being an officer, he couldn't become a Navy pilot. He was rejected. In 1921, Paul met Clara Louise Crosby, whom everyone called Polly. They married on June 7, 1921. Paul left the Navy, but aviation wouldn't leave him. He continued flying whenever he could, working as a mechanic and unofficial flight instructor. Then, in 1923, everything changed. The Navy began a new program that allowed enlisted men to become pilots. Paul immediately re-enlisted. In the spring of 1925, he graduated as a naval aviation pilot, an enlisted pilot in the United States Navy. It was a rare designation, reserved for exceptional men who could fly but lacked the educational background to become officers. For the next 12 years, Paul served with distinction. He flew with the Top Hatters, one of the Navy's oldest fighter squadrons. Then known as VF-1B, he flew from the USS Langley, the Navy's first aircraft carrier, and later from the USS Lexington and USS Saratoga. He piloted seaplanes launched from cruisers. He participated in simulated air raids against ships and naval stations. These were the early days of naval aviation, when everything was being invented for the first time. There were no manuals for many situations. Pilots had to improvise, experiment, and figure out what worked through trial and error. This experience would shape Paul's approach to problems for the rest of his life. Paul served as a flight instructor at the Pensacola Naval Air Station, where he met Polly. He also served as a VIP pilot at the Anacostia Naval Air Station in Washington, D.C., flying high-ranking officers. During these years, Paul and Polly had 4 children. Constance, born in 1924, Julie Marie, born in 1925, Paul Clyde, born in 1928, and Nathaniel Irvin, born in 1938. In December 1939, after 21 years of service, Paul retired from the Navy as a petty officer. He was 40 years old, had a wife and 4 children to support, and needed a new career. A friend suggested he consider the Philippines, where there were opportunities in the burgeoning aviation industry. The Philippines was a Commonwealth territory under the United States. slated to become independent within a few years under the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. Manila, the capital, was expanding and aviation was growing rapidly. In 1939, Paul accepted a position as personal pilot for Andres Soriano, a wealthy Filipino businessman. Shortly after, Soriano founded Philippine Airlines. Paul became the chief pilot and operations manager of the new airline. He oversaw daily operations, flew passengers, and explored potential routes. He flew PAL's Beechcraft, transporting gold from Paracale to Baguio, a mountain station where he could escape the sweltering heat of Manila. Life was good. Paul was doing what he loved, earning a good salary, and his family was thriving in the Philippines. But the peace wouldn't last long. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. A few hours later, Japanese planes appeared in the skies over the Philippines. They bombed Clark Field in Pampanga and Camp John Hay in Baguio. America was at war, and the Philippines was on the front line. Paul Gunn acted immediately. He evacuated the PAL Beechcraft to the decommissioned Grace Park Airfield in Caloocan, where he hid the planes in the nearby La Loma Cemetery. The country was at war, and a mix of civilian pilots and courageous individuals were being pressured into military service. Paul was commissioned as a captain in the United States Army Air Forces. Other PAL pilots, including Harold Slingsby and Lewis Connolly, joined him. Their mission began immediately, transporting personnel and supplies to Bataan and Corregidor using PAL aircraft. Paul made repeated flights to Clark Field, transporting personnel to Del Monte Airfield in Bukidnon, where the surviving B-17s had taken refuge. He flew unarmed and unarmored missions in hostile airspace, delivering medical supplies to troops besieged in Bataan. For these flights, he was later awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, but then came the order that changed everything. In late December 1941, Paul was ordered to fly the President of the Philippines, Manuel Quezon, and his family to Mindanao. After that, on December 24, 1941, Christmas Eve, he received orders to transport high-ranking officers to Australia and remain there. The decision tore Paul apart. His wife Polly and their 4 children, Constance, 17, Julie, 16, Paul Clyde, 13, and Nathaniel, just 3, were with him in Manila. He didn't want to leave them, but orders were orders. Before leaving, Paul withdrew his entire military salary and borrowed as much money as he could. He gave it all to Polly. His instructions were direct and frightening. If she were captured by the Japanese, she should say that he had been killed in a plane crash a few weeks earlier. It was his desperate attempt to protect her from retaliation. Paul took off for Australia with a heavy heart, leaving his family behind. It was a dangerous and frantic flight, but he and his passengers arrived safely in Brisbane. A few days later, his worst predictions came true. On January 2, 1942, Japanese forces captured Manila. On January 20, 1942, Polly Gunn and her 4 children were sent to the Santo Tomas University internment camp in Manila. They were prisoners of the Japanese, along with thousands of other American and Allied civilians. Conditions at Santo Tomas were terrible. The inmates faced overcrowding, inadequate food rations, limited medical care, and constant uncertainty about their fate. Nathaniel, Paul's youngest son, was only 3 years old when he entered the camp. He would spend the next 3.5 years of his childhood behind barbed wire. Dan Stickle, the PAL maintenance superintendent and close friend of Paul, was also captured and sent to Santo Tomas. He managed to convince the Japanese that he was just a civilian mechanic, which spared him the harsher treatment reserved for military personnel. Paul arrived in Brisbane, Australia, and received the news that his family was trapped. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His wife and children were in the hands of the Japanese, and he was thousands of kilometers away, unable to help them. From that moment on, Paul Gunn fought 3 wars simultaneously. He fought the official war against Japan. He fought to rescue his family. and he fought against any rule, regulation, or person that tried to stop him from doing any of those things. His friends and fellow officers noticed the change in him. Outwardly, Paul maintained his jovial exterior, always ready with a story or a joke. But inside, the knowledge that his family was in the enemy's hands burned incessantly, and Paul Gunn was about to become the most dangerous man in the Pacific for the Japanese. On January 20th, 1942, while his family was hospitalized in Manila, Paul Gunn was in Brisbane facing a different crisis. 20 crated P-40 Kitty Hawks had arrived at the port. The fighter planes were desperately needed, but they were in crates and required assembly. Paul assembled a team of American and Australian personnel and began unpacking and assembling the Kitty Hawks. He also gathered 25 pilots from the 17th Fighter Group who had recently arrived in Brisbane from the Philippines to help with the assembly. It was hard work, but Paul pushed his team relentlessly. The young aviators among his work team began calling the 40-year-old man by his new nickname, Pappy. The name stuck. From then on, Paul Irvin Gunn would be known as Pappy Gunn. By the end of January 1942, the Kitty Hawks were fully assembled and flight tested. On February 16, 1942, 17 Kitty Hawks formed into 2 flights, left Brisbane. Pappy led one of the flights in his Beechcraft. 3 planes crashed along the way, but 14 reached Darwin, then proceeded to Java, Indonesia, in preparation for combat. But Pappy couldn't stop thinking about his family trapped in the Philippines. He continued flying solo missions back to the Philippines whenever he could get away, rescuing more fighter pilots from Del Monte, Bukidnon. He flew without official authorization, simply getting on a plane and going. Nobody dared stop him. During this period, Pappy met Major John Big Jim Davies, commander of the 27th Bombardment Group. Davies and his men had been en route to the Philippines when the war broke out. They arrived in Australia without their planes. Davies and Pappy became close friends, united by their frustration with military bureaucracy and their determination to take the fight to the Japanese. In March 1942, Pappy and Big Jim learned of an entire squadron of B-25 Mitchell bombers sitting idle in Melbourne. The planes had been delivered to Australia for the Dutch Air Force, but the Dutch were short of pilots. The B-25s had remained unused for some time. Pappy and Big Jim simply appropriated the planes. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for approval. They simply took the B-25s and started flying them. Pappy also appropriated some bomb sites from the Dutch for the B-25s. On April 5, 1942, the B-25s that Pappy Gunn and Big Jim Davies had seized from the Dutch were used in their first combat in an attack on Gasmata. It was the beginning of something big. On April 11, 1942, 11 of these B-25 Mitchells and 3 B-17 Flying Fortresses left Charters Towers via Darwin for Del Monte to attack Japanese ships and fortifications in the Philippines. Pappy piloted one of the B-25s. They were equipped with long-range tanks for the long trip to Del Monte, where the tanks were removed and replaced with bombs. The mission was partially successful, but it became known as Mission Royce. They returned to Charters Towers laden with evacuees after the attack. Pappy flew the last B-25 out of Mindanao and arrived back in Australia several hours after the rest of the group. His long-range fuel tank had been hit by gunfire. He used long-range cruising techniques to bring the plane back home. During one of these missions, Pappy's luck eventually ran out. While flying the NPC-56 over the Gulf of Moro, he encountered a Japanese patrol seaplane. The Japanese strafed the Beech-18, which crashed into a coconut plantation. By sheer luck, the plantation owner, one of his regular passengers during peacetime, rescued Pappy and his co-pilot. They managed to return to Darwin. It was during this chaotic period that Pappy began to develop his reputation. He was known for his daring, low-altitude piloting. He was known for ignoring regulations when they got in his way. And he was known for his seemingly magical ability to keep planes flying when others would give up. But Pappy's true genius was yet to be revealed. And it all started with a simple question. What if we could put more machine guns on those planes? In July 1942, Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers arrived in Brisbane. The 27th Bombardment Group, which had now become the 3rd Bombardment Group, finally had aircraft. But there were serious problems with the A-20s. The A-20's frontal armament consisted of 4 .30 caliber machine guns along the underside of the nose. It was light armament, completely inadequate for low-level attacks against Japanese ships and land installations. The A-24 Dauntless aircraft that the group had used before were too slow and poorly armed to survive if attacked by Japanese fighters. Pappy Gunn was convinced that heavier armament could be fitted inside the nose section of the A-20 bomber's bay. He began experimenting, working in a shelter at Charter Towers. The problem was finding weapons. The supply of 50 caliber Browning AN-M2 machine guns from the U.S. Army Air Forces was severely limited throughout the Southwest Pacific area. Pappy and his teams began scouring Australia and the Solomon Islands for any 50 caliber weapons and ammunition they could beg, borrow, or steal. He recovered weapons from destroyed fighter jets. He stole weapons from supply depots. There are rumors that he even drew a weapon on a supply officer, which got him banned from the Brisbane area for several months. But he got the weapons. In August 1942, General Major George C. Kenny arrived in Australia to assume command of the air war. During a visit to the 3rd Strike Group at Charter Towers, a few days after his arrival, he was introduced to Pappy Gunn. At the time, Pappy was in a bunker working on converting a recently arrived A-20 from a light bomber into a strafer. Kenny was impressed. Here was a retired Navy petty officer, now an Army captain, who was improvising solutions to problems that engineers said were impossible. When Kenny learned that Pappy was using weapons from destroyed fighter planes, he was even more impressed by Pappy's ingenuity. Kenny immediately made Pappy a member of his personal staff, putting the old naval aviator in charge of special projects. It was one of the most important decisions Kenny made during the entire war. The A-20 conversion involved installing 4 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, in addition to the original 4 .30 caliber machine guns. The 50 caliber guns were fired by the pilot. Pappy also installed bomb racks to carry parafrag bombs, fragmentation bombs that descended on small parachutes. Parafrag bombs were a brilliant idea. They floated gently down on their parachutes and exploded over stationary targets, raining down fragments. Some contained phosphorus, igniting whatever the fragments tore through. Kenny ordered Pappy to modify 16 additional A-20s. The work was carried out at the depot facility at Eagle Farm Field in Brisbane. The teams worked day and night to complete the conversions. On September 12, 1942, Pappy's modified A-20s were used in the successful attack against a Japanese airfield at Buna. The strafers flew low, their 50 caliber machine guns tearing through parked Japanese aircraft, while parafrag bombs exploded over fuel depots. It was a spectacular success. The A-20s proved highly effective in low-level attacks against Japanese ships and land targets. The 50 caliber armor-piercing shells tore through the sides of all but the most heavily armored Japanese warships. Satisfied with the success of the initial modifications, Kenny ordered Pappy to modify B-25 Mitchell bombers by adding more forward-firing machine guns to each aircraft. This was a much larger project. The B-25 was a medium bomber, much larger than the A-20, but Pappy was confident it could work. Work began in late 1942. Pappy carried out the initial modifications at Eagle Farms Field in Brisbane, working with Jack Fox, the technical representative for North American aircraft. They started with the B-25 planes that Pappy and Big Jim had appropriated from the Dutch. The first conversion was ambitious. Pappy installed 4 50 caliber forward-firing machine guns in the nose, plus 2 more in conformal packages on each side of the fuselage below the cockpit, a total of 8 forward-firing machine guns fired by the pilot. But when the plane was loaded with fuel and ammunition, A problem immediately became apparent. It was so heavily loaded in the nose that it wouldn't fly. The center of gravity was completely off. When General Kenny came to see Pappy's modified B-25 prototype, he asked the obvious question, "What about the CG?" meaning center of gravity. Pappy replied with his characteristic confidence, "Oh, we threw that away to save weight." It was a joke, but the truth wasn't much better. The first plane was so heavy in the nose that it didn't want to fly. Pappy's ground crew named the plane Pappy's Folly after the failed flight attempt. But Pappy didn't give up. He never gave up. He solved the problem by moving the weapons package further back in the fuselage and relocating the fuel tank from the fuselage to bring the center of gravity within the proper range. It took weeks of work and numerous tests. Finally, the modified B-25 was ready for flight. Pappy took the plane to Charter Towers and then to New Guinea to demonstrate it to the pilots of the 3rd Attack Group and let some of them fly it. The pilots were amazed. The firepower was incredible. 850 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously created a cloud of lead that destroyed anything in its path. After Pappy proved that the conversion would fly, Kenny authorized the conversion of 12 B-25s, enough to equip a full squadron. Pappy had drawn up the plans, and the depot in Brisbane began work on the additional. Mitchells, the first B-25Cs to receive extra firepower, were fitted with 2 additional 50 caliber machine guns in the nose of the bomber to accompany the 2 already mounted there. Some modified B-25 strafers in Brisbane during April-May 1943 carried, in addition to the nose battery of 4 50 caliber guns, a single fixed forward-firing 20mm cannon in the position of about 4 o'clock. When looking at a nose strafer, the 20mm guns were not very effective due to the problem of synchronizing their firing trajectory with the nose guns, among other issues. They were soon removed, and the position was re-rigged. But the experiment showed Pappy's willingness to try anything that could give the Allies an advantage. Pappy's modified B-25 strafers quickly became a nightmare for Japanese forces. The warship's primary targets included Japanese coastal barges, supply ships, merchant vessels, and even their escorts. The 50 caliber armor-piercing shells, fired at 850 rounds per minute and traveling at 2,910 feet per second, would blast through the sides of all but the most heavily armored Japanese warships. The 50 caliber machine guns tore through the lightly built Japanese planes. The Mitchells left behind a trail of parafrag bombs floating gently down on small parachutes to explode over parked planes and fuel depots. Raining down fragments, Pappy also worked on bomb sites, auxiliary fuel tanks, and dozens of other modifications. He experimented with 30 water-cooled 30 caliber machine guns in the bomb bay, pointed downwards to strafe troops in breached trenches. The vibration loosened the skin around the bomb bay, dictating abandonment, but it showed Pappy's willingness to try anything. He was the first to mount the 75mm gun in the nose of a B-25. He flew the modified gun in an attack with the 3rd, his former group, and hit the fire control unit of a Japanese destroyer, which required its guns to be controlled individually and ineffectively. The ship was then sunk with a 1,000-pound bomb, although Pappy insisted in all official proclamations that he had sunk it with an airborne 75mm gun. Pappy's ability to solve problems through hands-on experimentation, rather than engineering calculations, made him invaluable. While engineers debated whether something was feasible, Pappy simply built and tested it. If it worked, great. If it didn't, he tried something else. Pappy's modified B-25s were ready. Now they needed a chance to prove their worth in combat. That chance would come in March 1943. In a battle that would change the course of the war in the Pacific. In late February 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted coded Japanese messages revealing that a large convoy was scheduled to depart from Rabaul for Lae, New Guinea in early March. The convoy would carry 6,900 soldiers from the 51st Division, along with provisions, weapons, ammunition, and aviation fuel. General Kenny saw this as the perfect opportunity to test Pappy Gunn's B-25 strafers in combat. A squadron was equipped in time to perform effective service. The pilots trained intensively in low-level attack tactics and skip bombing, dropping bombs that bounced across the water before hitting the sides of the ships. Shortly after midnight on March 1st, 1943, the Japanese convoy left Rabaul and charted its course along the north coast of New Britain. Packed into 8 transports were the main reinforcements for the garrison at Leh, an advanced base at that time under serious Allied pressure. The convoy escort was top-notch. 8 of the Imperial Navy's most battle-hardened destroyers were assembled under the banner of Rear Admiral Kimura Masatomi. Surrounding the transports were Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo, each a veteran of Guadalcanal. Allied reconnaissance planes first spotted the convoy on the afternoon of March 1st, still north of New Britain. But cloudy skies shielded the attack ships until the following morning. The Japanese had high hopes that the cloud cover would protect them until Leh. But when the skies began to clear, they knew they were in trouble. Early on March 2nd, a force of 6 RAAF A-20 Bostons attacked Leh to reduce its ability to provide support. At 10 a.m., another Liberator encountered the convoy. 8 B-17s took off to attack the ships, followed an hour later by another 20. The B-17s encountered the convoy and attacked with 1,000-pound bombs from 5,000 feet. Long-range B-17s scored fatal hits on Kyokusei Maru, but the large transport remained afloat long enough for over 900 troops to be transferred to Yukikaze and Asagumo. These 2 destroyers then left the formation, sped toward Leh, and disembarked their passengers. But the worst was yet to come. The Japanese turned the southern corner through the Vitiaz Strait and were entering the Gulf of Huon, just 80 miles from their destination. Clear weather and bright sunshine awaited them. On March 3, 1943, the convoy was located in the Gulf of Huon, heading towards Leh in bright sunlight. It was time for Pappy Gunn and his B-25 strafers to show what they could do. Relief Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron led an attack, followed by modified B-25 strafers. 13 B-25s from the 90th Bombardment Squadron, all equipped with Pappy's armament modifications, roared toward the convoy at low altitude. What happened next was devastating. The B-25s descended to the level of the waves, their 850 caliber machine guns spitting fire. Just 200 feet above the water, they strafed the ship's superstructures, shattering anti-aircraft defenses and killing Japanese crewmen in their gun positions. Then they dropped their bombs in skip-bombing attacks. The 500-pound bombs ricocheted across the water like smooth stones skipping across a lake, striking the sides of the ships below the waterline where the armor was weakest. The explosions ripped open the ship's hulls, flooding compartments and causing catastrophic damage. One of the B-25 pilots, observing the destruction, later said it was like shooting fish in a barrel. Pappy's strafers turned what should have been a safe crossing into a massacre. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea continued for 3 days, from March 2nd to 4th, 1943. But the decisive day was March 3rd. When Pappy's modified B-25 strafers devastated the Japanese convoy. During the attacks of March 3rd, the B-25 sank all 8 transports and destroyed 4 of the 8 escort destroyers. The Teo Maru was hit by skip bombs and sank rapidly. The Kyokusei Maru, already damaged from the previous day, received further hits and finally sank. The Shinai Maru, the Ayo Maru, the Nojima and the Oigawa Maru all went to the bottom. The destroyers Shirayuki, Tokitsukaze and Asashio were all sunk by combined machine gun and skip bomb attacks. The Shikinami, Uranami, Yukikaze, Arashio and Asagumo fled back to Rabaul, severely damaged. But the destruction didn't stop when the ship sank. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were in the water, clinging to wreckage, wearing life jackets or swimming desperately. The Allies had P-38 Lightning and P-40 Kitty Hawk fighter planes patrolling the area. For hours, these fighters strafed Japanese survivors in the water. It was brutal. It was horrific. But it was also total war in the Pacific in 1943. The Allies were unwilling to allow any of the 6,900 Japanese soldiers to reach Lae to reinforce the garrison there. It is estimated that between 2,090 and 3,664 Japanese soldiers died during the battle, most of them in the water after their ships sank. Only about 2,700 Japanese soldiers were rescued by the destroyers that fled back to Rabaul. Of these, nearly 1,000 were from the 51st Infantry Division. The others were ship crews. The convoy had completely failed to reinforce Lae. Allied losses were surprisingly light. 2 B-17 flying fortresses were shot down, 1 P-38 Lightning fighter was lost, and 3 Australian Beaufighters were brought down. 1 B-25 was so badly damaged that it had to make an emergency landing on a beach. 13 Allied airmen died. It was one of the most unequal victories of the war in the Pacific. For the loss of a few planes and a dozen men, the Allies destroyed an entire convoy, sank 12 ships, and killed thousands of enemy soldiers who would never have reached their destination. General Kenny was ecstatic. Pappy's modifications had proven their worth beyond any doubt. He immediately ordered more B-25s to be modified with the 8-gun strafer package. Within months, most of the B-25s in the Southwest Pacific Theater were being converted. The Imperial Japanese Navy drew grim conclusions from the battle. They realized they could no longer move large numbers of troops by sea within range of land-based Allied aircraft. Their plans to reinforce positions throughout New Guinea had to be dramatically revised. From then on, the Japanese would be forced to use submarines or fast barges traveling at night to move troops. Large troop transport convoy operations like the one destroyed in the Bismarck were a thing of the past. Historians consider the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as one of the turning points in the Pacific War. It effectively ended Japan's ability to reinforce its garrisons in New Guinea. With its sea routes cut off, Japanese forces in Lae, Salamaua, and elsewhere were doomed, and at the heart of this victory were the weapons modifications that Pappy Gunn had improvised in shelters and depots across Australia. His 8-gun B-25 strafers proved to be the game-changer. They transformed medium bombers into ship killers, capable of decimating entire convoys with machine guns and skip bombs. Pappy wasn't personally at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He was back in Australia, working on further modifications. But his planes were there, and they made the difference. Pappy's madness had become the most feared weapon in the Southwest Pacific. But for Pappy, the war was still personal. His family was still trapped in Santo Tomas, and every Japanese ship sunk, every Japanese aircraft destroyed, brought him one step closer to freeing them. Following their overwhelming success at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Pappy Gunn's modifications became standard throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. Hundreds of B-25 Mitchells were converted into strafers, each carrying at least 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. But Pappy didn't stop there. He continued experimenting, continued improvising, continued making modifications that engineers said were impossible. He installed 75mm cannons in the noses of B-25s, turning them into flying artillery. He developed auxiliary fuel tanks that extended the aircraft's range by hundreds of miles. He modified P-38 Lightning fighter jets to carry more weapons and bombs. He worked on bomb targeting systems that improved accuracy. He developed new types of bombs and ammunition. He worked on literally dozens of projects simultaneously, relentlessly leading his team of mechanics and technicians. General Kenny became increasingly dependent on Pappy. Whenever there was a technical problem he needed to solve, he called Pappy. Whenever there was a new tactic that required new equipment, Pappy figured out how to make it work. On September 5, 1943, Pappy was promoted to Major. On February 29, 1944, he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. He had come a long way since his time as an enlisted Navy pilot. Denied a commission because he lacked a college education, but honors and promotions meant little to Pappy. His family was still stuck in Manila, and that fact consumed him. He flew combat missions whenever he could, including some of the most dangerous missions of the war. In July 1943, Pappy flew a photographic reconnaissance mission over Rabaul, the most heavily defended Japanese stronghold in the Southwest Pacific. His B-25 was attacked by Japanese Zero fighters and badly damaged. Pappy managed to bring the plane back, although it was riddled with bullet holes. In October 1943, he flew a low-level attack against Wewak, destroying numerous Japanese aircraft on the ground. In December 1943, he participated in attacks against targets at Cape Gloucester. He accumulated combat missions like some men collect stamps, flying whenever possible, in addition to his administrative duties. Pappy's contributions to aerial warfare went beyond mere aircraft modifications. He helped develop entirely new tactics for aerial warfare. The coordinated strafing and skip-bombing attack that was so devastating in the Bismarck Sea became standard tactic. He trained pilots in very low-level attacks, teaching them to fly 50 feet above the waves to avoid radar and anti-aircraft fire. He developed formations that maximized firepower while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. He created maintenance procedures that kept more planes flying with fewer parts and personnel. Military historians credit Pappy Gunn as one of the fathers of the modern ground attack aircraft. His B-25 strafers were the direct ancestors of the specialized attack aircraft that came later. The A-26 Invader, the A-1 Skyraider, the A-10 Warthog. The concept of a heavily armed aircraft designed specifically for low-level attacks began with Pappy. His philosophy of allowing pilots and ground crews to improvise solutions instead of waiting for engineers to approve every change transformed military aircraft maintenance. Ground crews began making field modifications that improved performance and reliability without waiting for official approval. Meanwhile, in Santo Tomas, Polly Gunn and her 4 children were surviving. Conditions were terrible and worsened with each passing month as the war continued. Food rations were repeatedly cut. Medical assistance was almost non-existent. Diseases were rampant, but somehow they survived. They didn't know if Paul was alive or dead. They had no information about the progress of the war. All they could do was survive another day, then another, hoping against hope that one day they would be freed. And Pappy continued fighting, each mission bringing him closer to the day he could finally rescue his family. In October 1944, American forces landed in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur kept his promise to return, but Manila, where Pappy's family was imprisoned in Santo Tomas, was still in Japanese hands. Liberation from the internment camp would have to wait. Pappy flew missions over the Philippines, strafing Japanese targets, knowing his family was somewhere below him. The frustration of being so close and yet unable to reach them was almost unbearable. But he kept flying, kept fighting, kept destroying everything Japanese he could find. As 1944 turned into 1945, American forces drew ever closer to Manila. In January 1945, U.S. troops landed in Lingayen Gulf and began advancing toward Manila. But everyone feared what the Japanese might do to the prisoners before American troops could reach them. There were reports that the Japanese were executing prisoners in other camps. There were rumors that the Santo Tomas camp was being mined for demolition. Time was running out. On February 3, 1945, the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division launched a lightning attack on Manila. They raced past the stunned Japanese, fighting and advancing rapidly toward the University of Santo Tomas. At 9:00 p.m. on February 3, 1945, American tanks burst through the gates of Santo Tomas. The 3,700 inmates were freed after 3 years and 2 weeks of imprisonment. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children, Constance, now 20 years old, Julie, 19, Paul Clyde, 16, and Nathaniel, 6. Nathaniel had spent half of his young life as a prisoner of war. The American troops were shocked by what they found. The inmates were emaciated, sickly, and malnourished. Many could barely walk. They had survived on starvation rations for months. Disease had killed hundreds, but they were alive and they were free. Papi was in Tacloban, Leyte, when he received the news. Santo Tomas had been released. His family was free. He immediately flew to Manila, desperate to see them after 3 years of separation. The reunion was emotionally devastating. Polly had lost 40 pounds. The children were thin and pale. Nathaniel barely remembered his father. But they were alive. Against all odds, despite 3 years of imprisonment, hunger, and disease, they had survived. Papi arranged for his family to be evacuated to Australia as quickly as possible. They needed adequate food, medical assistance, and time to begin healing physically and emotionally. Within days, they were on a plane heading south, away from the war-torn Philippines. After his family was safe, Papi returned to work. The war wasn't over yet. There were still Japanese targets to destroy, more aircraft modifications to make, and more missions to fly. But something had changed in him. The weight he had carried for 3 years, the constant fear for his family's fate, had been lifted. Papi flew additional missions during the final months of the war. He continued working on aircraft modifications. He continued training pilots. But now he could do it all, knowing his family was safe. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. Papi had survived the entire war. His innovations had helped win the war in the Pacific. His family had survived the prisoner of war camps. Against all odds, they had made it. Papi was decorated with numerous medals for his courage and innovation, including the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and the Air Medal with 20 oak leaf clusters. But the decorations mattered less to him than the fact that his family was alive and the war was over. After the war, Papi Gunn continued serving in the United States Army Air Forces, which became the United States Air Force in 1947. He was promoted to colonel in 1948, but the man who had thrived in the chaos and improvisation of war found the peacetime army restrictive and frustrating Papi and his family briefly. Settled in the Philippines, where he served as an Air Force officer. Manila was being rebuilt after the devastation of the war. Philippine Airlines was being reformed, and Papi helped with the reconstruction efforts of the airline where he had once been chief pilot. But Papi's life after the war was marked by tragedy. His wife, Polly, who had survived 3 years of imprisonment in Japanese camps, developed serious health problems. The hardships of Santo Tomas had taken their toll. She died on October 11, 1946, just 20 months after being liberated. She was only 48 years old. Polly's death devastated Papi. They had been married for 25 years. She had survived the prisoner of war camps, only to die less than 2 years after liberation. Papi blamed himself for leaving her in the Philippines when he had to evacuate to Australia in 1941. Papi continued serving, but something had left him. The man who had been known for his jovial cheerfulness, his willingness to try anything, his seemingly limitless energy, had become quiet and introspective. He still flew, still worked on projects, but the spark had diminished. On October 11, 1957, exactly 11 years after Polly's death, Papi Gunn suffered a fatal heart attack in Manila. He was only 57 years old. His body was returned to the United States and buried in Arlington National Cemetery on October 22, 1957, with full military honors. General George Kenney, who had recognized Papi's genius back in 1942 and put him in charge of special projects, wrote about him extensively in his memoirs. Kenney credited Papi with modifications that saved countless American lives and changed the course of the air war in the Pacific. Papi's contributions to military aviation cannot be overstated. His strafer modifications of the B-25 Mitchells established the model for ground attack aircraft that would dominate the battlefields for the next 50 years. Every modern attack aircraft, from the A-10 Warthog to the AC-130 gunship, owes something to Pappy's pioneering work. His philosophy of field improvisation, of letting ground crews make modifications without waiting for engineers' approval, transformed military aircraft maintenance. During the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and subsequent conflicts, field mechanics continued Pappy's tradition of doing whatever was necessary to keep the planes flying and give pilots every possible advantage. The skip bombing that Pappy helped develop was used not only in World War II, but also in the Korean War. The low-level attack tactics he pioneered became standard doctrine. His work on auxiliary fuel tanks, bomb targeting systems, and weapons installations informed decades of military aircraft design. But perhaps Pappy's most important legacy was his demonstration that innovation doesn't just come from engineers at drawing boards, but from practical people in the field who see problems and solve them. Pappy didn't have an engineering degree. He had left school after the 6th grade, but he had something more valuable: the ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. When they told him you couldn't put 8 .50 caliber machine guns in the nose of a B-25, he built one and flew it. When they told him the plane would be too heavy in the nose, he moved things around until it worked. When they told him you couldn't install a 75mm cannon on a medium bomber, he installed one anyway. This willingness to try, to experiment, to fail, and try again is what made Pappy guns so invaluable during the war. And that is why his legacy continues today in every attack aircraft that flies, in every mechanic who makes a field modification that improves performance, in every pilot who benefits from innovations developed not in sterile laboratories, but in warm shelters in the combat zone. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can see a B-25 Mitchell on display. While not one of the aircraft modified by Pappy, it represents the legacy of his innovation. The plaques tell of the strafer modifications that made the Mitchell so effective against Japanese ships. 4 of Pappy's children lived long and productive lives. They carried on memories of their father, the daring pilot, the tireless innovator, the man who fought 3 wars simultaneously against the Japanese to rescue his family, and against anyone who said something couldn't be done. Paul "Pappy" Gunn was an unlikely man to change history. A retired Navy aviator without a college degree, a civilian airline pilot caught up in the war, a man who started modifying airplanes because he was desperate to do anything to help free his trapped family. But he proved that innovation doesn't require sophisticated credentials. It only requires a willingness to try, the courage to fail, and the determination to keep experimenting until you find something that works. In that sense, Pappy Gunn embodied the American spirit of practical innovation that won World War II. His modifications transformed the B-25 Mitchell from a standard medium bomber into what General Kenny called the most devastating ship killer ever developed. They destroyed thousands of tons of Japanese shipping, cut enemy supply lines, and helped win the Pacific War. And it all began with a desperate father willing to try anything, to defy anyone, to break any rule that stood in his way of bringing his family home. That was Pappy Gunn, the mad pilot who bolted cannons onto his bomber and changed aerial warfare forever. June 26, 1943, skies over France. Captain Robert S. Johnson struggles to keep his P-47 Thunderbolt airborne, while a German Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter systematically destroys it. 200 rounds of 20mm ammunition pierce its fuselage. The cockpit explodes into fragments of glass and metal. His body is wounded by shrapnel. Flight control barely responds. By all aviation standards, he should be dead. The plane should be crashing in flames. But against all odds, Robert Johnson flies that mutilated Thunderbolt back through 200 miles of enemy territory and lands in England. This is the story of the hardest-to-kill pilot of World War II and the plane that simply refused to die. Robert Samuel Johnson was born on February 21st, 1920, in Lawton, Oklahoma. He grew up during the Great Depression, the son of a farmer who struggled to keep the land productive while dust storms ravaged the Great Plains. Life was hard, money was scarce, but Robert developed characteristics that would serve him well in combat: resilience, determination, and an absolute refusal to give up when things got tough. As a young man, Robert was fascinated by aviation. He read every airplane magazine he could find. He built meticulous models out of balsa wood. He dreamed of flying, but it seemed impossible for a poor farm boy from Oklahoma. Then on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II, and suddenly the Army Air Force desperately needed pilots. Robert enlisted immediately. He passed flight training with exceptional marks. Instructors noted that he had natural talent, excellent coordination, superior spatial judgment, and the most important quality for a fighter pilot: controlled aggression. He wasn't reckless, but absolutely determined. When he had a target in his sights, he didn't give up. In January 1943, now Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson arrived in England, assigned to the 61st Fighter Squadron of the legendary 56th Fighter Group. The 56th flew the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the heaviest and most powerful fighter in the Army Air Force, weighing almost 8 tons, fully loaded and powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine. The P-47 was an impressive machine. Pilots had a love-hate relationship with the Thunderbolt. It was enormous compared to the sleek, agile fighters they were used to. The cockpit was so high off the ground that they needed a ladder to get in. It took forever to climb to combat altitude. In close-quarters maneuvers with agile German fighters, the P-47 couldn't compete in tight turns, but it had devastating advantages. It was incredibly fast in a dive. No German fighter could follow a P-47 diving at full speed. It had impressive range, with external fuel tanks. And most importantly, it was built like a tank. Engineer Alexander Kartveli had designed protection and redundancy into every system. An armored cockpit protected the pilot. A massive radial engine absorbed damage that would destroy inline engines. The airframe was built to withstand brutal punishment. Robert Johnson quickly adapted to the Thunderbolt. He learned to use its advantages: speed, dive, devastating firepower from 850 caliber machine guns. And he learned to avoid maneuver engagements where more agile German fighters had the advantage. He was a smart tactician as well as a skilled pilot. Their first missions were bomber escorts, flying protection for formations of B-17s and B-24s attacking targets in occupied Europe. It was dangerous work. German fighters attacked the bombers aggressively. Anti-aircraft flak created curtains of exploding metal. Each mission meant hours flying over hostile territory where mistake meant death or capture. In his first 10 missions, Robert demonstrated the qualities that would make him one of the greatest American aces. He was aggressive but disciplined. He attacked when he had the advantage, retreated when he didn't. He fiercely protected his wingmen, and he had exceptional vision. He frequently spotted enemy fighters before anyone else, giving his formation a crucial advantage. But on June 26, 1943, during his 27th mission, Robert Johnson would face a test that would define not only his career, but the very legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. And what happened that day would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aerial warfare. June 26, 1943, began like many other mornings in Halesworth, England, home of the 56th Fighter Group. Low fog covered the English countryside. Pilots were woken at 400 for a briefing at 500. Today's mission: escorting B-17 bombers attacking German industrial facilities near Paris. It would be deep penetration into occupied territory, dangerous but routine by 1943 standards. Robert Johnson calmly went through his pre-mission routine. He meticulously checked his flight equipment: suit, parachute, survival pistol, first aid kit. He ate a light breakfast. Experience had taught him that a full stomach in high-altitude combat was a recipe for nausea. He walked to his P-47, number 428487, which he had nicknamed Half Pint, in homage to its relatively small size compared to other pilots. The Half Pint was a standard production aircraft, but Robert knew it intimately after 26 missions together. He knew how the engine performed best with specific mixture settings, how heavy the controls became above 25,000 feet, how it tended to pull slightly to the right during high-speed dives. Pilot and machine had become one. Takeoff was at 0645. 56 P-47s of the 56th Group formed up over England, then headed across the English Channel. They rendezvoused with the bomber formation over the French coast, 60 B-17s in tight box formation, each laden with tons of bombs. The Thunderbolts took up escort positions, some above, some on the flanks, some behind. The first hour was quiet. Occasional flak dotted the sky, but it was inaccurate. No enemy fighters appeared. Some pilots began to relax. Perhaps it would be an easy mission. Robert Johnson knew better. The Germans often waited until formations were deep in occupied territory before attacking. When Allied aircraft were far from home and low on fuel, at 0920, when the formation was 60 miles southeast of Paris, the German fighters attacked. First came Messerschmitt Bf-109s from high altitude, diving through the bombers. Then Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacked from the flanks. The sky exploded in chaotic combat. Red and orange traces streaked in all directions. Explosions of flak dotted the space between fighting planes. Robert dove into a Bf-109 that was lining up behind a B-17. His 8 machine guns roared, traces converging on the German fighter. Impacts glittered on the 109's wing. The German fighter rolled violently and plunged, black smoke billowing out. Robert didn't follow. His mission was to protect the bombers, not to pursue individual victories. He returned to formation, and that's when he saw trouble. 2 FW-190s were attacking a stray B-17 that had fallen out of formation with a damaged engine. Robert immediately dove to intercept. His speed increased dramatically. The P-47 accelerated like a rocket in a dive. He positioned himself behind the nearest FW-190 and opened fire. The German pilot saw the tracers and pulled up in a tight turn. Robert followed, but the FW-190 was more agile at low speeds. The German rolled and dived, then pulled up again. Robert tried to follow, but the P-47 was too heavy for tight maneuvering combat. He was losing position. That's when he made a critical mistake. Focused on the target ahead, he lost situational awareness. He didn't see the second FW-190 maneuvering behind him. He didn't realize he had strayed too far from the main formation. He was isolated, vulnerable, and about to pay a terrible price for that momentary lapse in attention. Robert's first warning was the sound. A sound no pilot ever wants to hear. The rapid crack, crack, crack of 20mm guns impacting metal. He instantly threw the controls forward and to the side, diving and rolling violently. But it was too late. The German pilot had positioned himself perfectly, and he wasn't wasting ammunition. 20mm rounds ripped through the right wing of the Half Pint. Explosions dotted the fuselage. The acrylic canopy shattered into sharp fragments. Robert felt sharp pain as shrapnel cut through his flight suit, piercing his forehead, cheek, and shoulder. Blood streamed into his eyes. Cold wind from 25,000 feet howled through the destroyed cockpit. He thrust the control forward violently, diving at a steep angle. The speed increased dramatically, 400 mph, 450, 480. The P-47 was vibrating with the extreme speed. Robert expected the German to give up the chase at such high speeds. Most pilots would have, but this German was different. He pursued relentlessly, firing burst after burst. More impacts hammered the Thunderbolt. The instrument panel exploded in sparks and shattered glass. Half the gauges were dead. Smoke began to fill the cockpit. Robert could barely see anything. Blood in his eyes, smoke obscuring his vision. A partially destroyed canopy distorting his sight. He was flying nearly blind at almost 500 miles per hour. The German continued firing. It was methodical execution. He wasn't trying to shoot down the P-47 with a lucky burst. He was systematically destroying every component. Rounds cut through the hydraulic system. More punctured the fuel tanks. Others tore apart control systems. The half-pint was literally being torn apart in mid-air. Robert tried everything. He rolled violently left then right. He pulled up on a steep climb, then dove back down. He tried scissor maneuvers, abrupt reversals of direction. Nothing worked. The German stayed glued behind him, firing burst after burst. He was an exceptional pilot, experienced, determined, and he had Robert completely at his mercy. The controls grew progressively heavier. The right aileron barely responded. Control cables had been cut. The rudder was locking. The hydraulic system was broken. Robert was losing maneuverability. He could no longer defend himself effectively. He was just flying straight ahead while being destroyed. Then something extraordinary happened. Or perhaps it didn't. Robert felt the P-47 shudder with more impacts. Then, silence. The German guns stopped. Robert looked back through the smoke and debris to see the FW-190 still there, but not firing. The German flew alongside him for a moment, so close that Robert could see the pilot through the canopy. They made eye contact. The German pilot looked at the devastated P-47, then at the bleeding and wounded Robert. Then he did something unbelievable. He saluted, a pilot-to-pilot acknowledgement. Then he rolled and dove away. There were several theories as to why. Perhaps he had run out of ammunition. Perhaps he thought Robert was doomed anyway, and it wasn't worth wasting bullets. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was an act of warrior's respect, acknowledging that Robert had fought bravely and deserved a chance to try to get home. Whatever the reason, Robert was free from pursuit. But his situation was desperate. He was 200 miles behind enemy lines in a severely damaged plane. He was wounded and bleeding. Half of his instruments were dead. The controls barely responded, and he had to navigate back to England flying almost blind. The odds of survival were virtually zero, but Robert Johnson wasn't about to give up, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was about to prove exactly which pilot was up to it. They called it indestructible. Robert Johnson took stock of his situation. It wasn't encouraging. Blood continued to trickle into his eyes, from wounds to his head. His right shoulder burned where shrapnel had pierced it. Icy wind from high altitude howled through the shattered canopy, making it difficult to breathe. His fingers were going numb from the extreme cold. The plane was in worse condition. Through the smoke and blurred vision, Robert could see large holes piercing the right wing. The fuselage behind him looked like Swiss cheese, dozens of 20mm cannon holes. Hydraulic fluid stained the side of the fuselage. The instrument panel was a smoldering ruin. He had only a few basic instruments still working: compass, altimeter, and airspeed indicator. Everything else was dead. The controls were heavily responsive. The right aileron barely moved, cables evidently cut or damaged. The rudder was locked, hydraulic cylinders destroyed. Robert had to use brute force with both hands just to keep the wings level. Every small course adjustment required tremendous effort. Worse, he wasn't sure of his exact position. He'd been in maneuvering combat for several minutes, losing track of direction and distance. He knew he was somewhere southeast of Paris, but exactly where, and which direction to the coast. If he flew the wrong way, he could end up deeper in occupied France or over Germany. He would run out of fuel and be forced to make an emergency landing in enemy territory. Robert made a decision. He would use the sun for basic navigation. The sun was to the west, England was to the northwest. He would turn the wrecked P-47 so that the sun was slightly to his right and maintain that course. It wasn't precise navigation, but it was something. Turning was a nightmare. With damaged controls, he had to carefully coordinate the throttle, aileron, and rudder. The P-47 wanted to roll violently to the right where the aileron was damaged. Robert had to maintain constant pressure on the control just to keep the wings level. His arms were already trembling from the effort. He also had to deal with blood loss. His wounds weren't fatal, but they kept bleeding. He used one hand to press against the wound on his forehead while piloting with the other, alternating when his arms grew too tired. He needed to keep the blood out of his eyes to see. Altitude was another problem. Robert was at 22,000 feet, high enough that the thin air made breathing difficult through supplemental oxygen. But with the canopy destroyed, icy winds were draining heat from his body dangerously fast. He needed to descend to warmer air, but descending meant being more vulnerable to anti-aircraft flak from the German ground. Defenses that covered all of occupied France. He decided to descend gradually to 15,000 feet, low enough for warmth, high enough to avoid low-altitude flak. He descended slowly, 500 feet per minute, maintaining a northwest course. Each minute felt like an hour. His arms burned from the effort of gripping the controls. Blood loss was making him dizzy. The cold seeped through his flight suit, causing him to shiver uncontrollably. After what seemed like an eternity but was only 20 minutes, Robert saw something marvelous through the smoke and blurred vision: the French coast. That distinct line between land and sea. He was truly sailing in the right direction. If he could cross the English Channel, he had a chance of surviving. But crossing the Channel in a severely damaged plane was a challenge in itself. It was 80 miles of open water. If the engine failed, if the controls finally gave way, if he passed out from blood loss, he would fall into the channel and drown. There were no emergency landing fields, no places to land. It was all or nothing. Robert Johnson pressed the accelerator and drove the wounded half-pint toward the water. The English Channel stretched before Robert like a desert of grey water. White waves dotted the surface. On a normal day, it was a beautiful sight. Today, it looked like an abyss waiting to swallow him. 80 miles. Only 80 miles separated him from the relative safety of England. But in that wrecked P-47, every mile would be battle. Robert crossed the French coast at 15,000 feet. Immediately, German flak batteries positioned along the coast opened fire. Black explosions bloomed around him. Under normal conditions, he would have maneuvered aggressively to avoid flak. But with damaged controls, violent maneuvers would likely have resulted in complete loss of control. He flew straight and level, relying on altitude and speed for protection. Fragments of flak explosions glittered against the already damaged fuselage. A few more perforations in a plane that already looked like a machine gun target wouldn't make a difference. Robert maintained a steady course, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where England should be. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine continued to perform magnificently. Those 18 cylinders arranged in a radial pattern were proving their reputation for indestructibility. Several cylinders were probably damaged. The engine was running rougher than normal, vibrating through the frame. But it continued to generate power, turning the propeller, keeping the Thunderbolt in the air. It was a testament to the robust design that had prioritized reliability over maximum performance. Robert checked his remaining instruments. Altimeter 14,800 feet and steady. Airspeed indicator 210 millipenetration, slower than normal cruising speed, but acceptable. Compass 3 or 10 degrees, maintaining northwest course. Fuel. The gauge was among the dead instruments, so I had no idea how much was left. I had to trust that I had enough to get there. 15 minutes over the water. 20 minutes. His arms were in pure agony from gripping the controls against the damage. He tried to partially tie the controls with cord from the first aid kit to ease the strain, but it didn't work. The plane immediately tried to roll. He had to maintain constant manual pressure. There was no relief. The blood loss was visibly affecting him now. His vision was darkening at the edges. Waves of dizziness swept through him. He fought the urge to close his eyes just for a moment, just to rest. He knew that if he lost consciousness, he would die. The P-47 would roll and plunge into the channel. No one would ever know what happened. He began talking to himself aloud. "Come on, Bob, stay awake. Just a few more minutes. You can do it. You have to do it." He sang songs he'd learned in flight training. Silly, obscene, funny songs, anything to keep his brain engaged, to fight the growing darkness in his vision. 30 minutes over the water. 40 minutes. England should be appearing soon. It had to be. But all Robert saw was more grey water. He began to doubt. Was he flying in the right direction? Had he misjudged the navigation, and was he heading for the open Atlantic? No, he had followed the sun. He had to be right. Then through the fog and smoke and blood-stained vision he saw it. A dark line on the horizon. Land, the English coast. Robert felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost made him cry. He had crossed the channel. He was back in friendly territory. It wasn't safe yet. He had to land that wrecked plane without killing himself in the process. But at least he was over British soil. Robert flew the half-pint over the coast. British anti-aircraft batteries tracked him but didn't fire. They recognized the silhouette of the P-47 and saw that it was damaged. Robert needed to find an airfield fast. I had no idea how much fuel he had left. He could have minutes before the engine died. Robert Johnson spotted an airfield below. It wasn't Halesworth, his base, but it didn't matter. It was a runway, and it was English. Later he discovered it was Manston, a coastal emergency base specifically positioned to receive damaged aircraft returning from Europe. He tried to use the radio to communicate his emergency, but the system was dead, another component destroyed by German guns. He signaled by flapping his wings in an emergency pattern. Ground personnel saw and immediately understood. Fire trucks rushed into position. Ambulances sped toward the runway. The control tower cleared all air traffic. Robert set up for approach. First, he had to lower the landing gear. Normally this was simple. Pull a lever and the hydraulic system lowered the wheels. But his hydraulic system was destroyed. He had to use emergency backup, a manual pump requiring 100 physical pumps to lower the wheels mechanically. With one hand gripping heavy controls, Robert used the other to pump the emergency lever. Pump, pump, pump. Each pump required effort. His muscles burned. Sweat mingled with blood on his face. 50 pumps, 75, 90. Finally, he felt the impact as the landing gear locked into place. But he had no working indicators. He didn't know if all 3 wheels were down and locked or just some of them. It would be a gamble. Lining up for final approach was a nightmare. The controls were so heavy that even small adjustments were virtually impossible. The P-47 wanted to pull to the right, where the ailerons were damaged. Robert had to use almost full power just to keep the wings level. He was descending too fast, but he had no flaps. The hydraulic system that operated them was dead, 300 yards from the runway. 200, 100. The ground was approaching fast, very fast. Robert pulled back on the controls, trying to slow the descent. The P-47 resisted, heavy controls fighting against it. 50 yards, 25. The wheels slammed together with a brutal thud. The impact was so strong that Robert bit his tongue, blood filling his mouth. But the wheels held. All 3 had lowered. The Thunderbolt rolled down the runway, slowing. Robert slammed on the brakes, but like all hydraulic systems, they were dead. He cut the engine and let the plane roll, using only air resistance to slow down. Half-Pint finally stopped 2,000 feet down the track. The engine coughed once and died completely. Silence. After 2 hours of the constant roar of the engine and howling wind, the silence was almost shocking. Robert tried to move, but his muscles refused to respond. His arms were locked in position to grip the controls. He had to physically force them to relax. Fire trucks and ambulances arrived. Paramedics climbed onto the wings and opened the destroyed canopy. They were shocked by what they saw. Robert was covered in blood. His flight suit was torn and punctured. The interior of the cockpit looked like it had exploded. Shattered glass, twisted metal, destroyed instruments. "Christ," one of the paramedics murmured. "How are you still alive?" Robert tried to answer, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "The plane. Check the plane." The paramedics gently lifted him from the cockpit and laid him on a stretcher. As he was being carried to the ambulance, Robert turned his head to look back at the Half-Pint one last time. What he saw shocked him even through his exhaustion and pain. The P-47 looked like it had been through a shredder. The right wing was riddled with over 20 large holes. The fuselage literally had hundreds of gun and machine gun perforations. The canopy was completely destroyed. Fluids were leaking from multiple systems. It was a miracle the plane had flown at all, much less 200 miles back across the English Channel. Robert Desm. He gasped as he was being carried to the ambulance. But he had survived the impossible. And the story of his flight was only beginning to spread. While doctors treated Robert's injuries at the base hospital, mechanics began a detailed inspection of the half-pint. What they discovered was extraordinary and alarming. The aircraft had absorbed damage that should have been absolutely fatal multiple times over. The maintenance chief, Major Thomas, personally conducted the inspection with a team of engineers. They documented every perforation, every damaged system, every destroyed component. The final report would be used in maintenance training for years. They began with a basic count of impacts. After marking each visible perforation with chalk, they tallied the total: 21 20mm cannon holes and over 200 machine gun perforations. The concentration of damage was unbelievable. The right wing alone had been hit by 8 cannon rounds. The fuselage had taken 13 more. It was as if the German pilot had systematically targeted every critical section. The canopy was a complete wreck. The thick acrylic had been shattered by multiple impacts. Fragments had flown through the cockpit like machine gun fire. It was a miracle that Robert hadn't been blinded or killed instantly. The seat armor behind him had stopped several rounds that would otherwise have gone through his back. The instrument panel looked like a battlefield. Gauges were shattered. Wiring was cut. Electronic components were melted or disintegrated. Of 23 instruments, only 3 remained functional. Robert had flown 200 miles, essentially blind, relying only on a compass, altimeter, and airspeed indicator. The hydraulic system was a complete loss. Multiple rounds had punctured the main reservoir. Hydraulic lines were severed in at least 8 places. Fluid had completely leaked out. All hydraulically operated systems, flaps, brakes, propeller controls, were inoperative. The fact that Robert had managed to lower the landing gear via manual backup was extremely fortunate. The flight controls were critically damaged. Right aileron cables were partially severed. Only a few wires remained connecting the aileron controls. One more cable cut, and Robert would have lost control completely. The rudder system was severely compromised. The elevator cables were intact but damaged. It was extraordinary that the plane had remained controllable in any way. The R-2800 engine had taken multiple hits. 3 cylinders were completely destroyed. Pistons seized, blocks cracked. 4 others showed partial damage. Of the original 18 cylinders, only 11 were functioning when Robert landed. Still, the engine had generated enough power to fly across the channel. It was a testament to the robust radial design. Radial engines could lose multiple cylinders and continue operating where inline engines failed with a single damaged cylinder. The fuel tanks showed multiple perforations, but the self-sealing tank design had worked exactly as intended. When a bullet pierced the tank, the inner rubber layer expanded and sealed the hole automatically. Robert had lost a significant amount of fuel, but not all of it. Enough remained to get home. The fuselage structure showed extensive damage, but the primary structural integrity remained intact. Main load-bearing beams were unaffected. Wing ribs and spars were punctured but not broken. The P-47 had been designed with massive structural redundancy. It could lose secondary components without structural collapse. Major Thomas completed his inspection and prepared a report. His conclusions were clear. This aircraft suffered the most extensive combat damage ever documented on any P-47 that remained flyable. That the pilot was able to return to base and land safely is an extraordinary testament to both the robustness of the aircraft's design and the exceptional skill of the pilot. The report was sent up the chain of command. Republic Aviation, the manufacturer of the P-47, received a detailed copy. Engineers studied the damage patterns, learned what had worked and what could be improved. The half-pint became a case study in aircraft survivability design, but the question remained, would the plane ever fly again? Major Thomas initially declared it a total loss, the damage too extensive for economical repair. But others argued that precisely because it had survived so much, it should be rebuilt as a demonstration of the P-47's capabilities. The decision was made. The half-pint would be completely rebuilt. It would be used on training missions, showing new pilots exactly how much punishment a P-47 could absorb. And it would always bear visible battle scars, metal patches where repairs had been made, permanent reminders of that unbelievable day in June 1943, while the half-pint was being rebuilt. Robert Johnson spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries. He had multiple lacerations to his head and face from canopy fragments, a shrapnel wound to his right shoulder, extensive bruising from being thrown against the controls, mild concussion, but nothing permanent or disabling. More serious than the physical injuries was the psychological trauma. Robert had faced certain death for 15 minutes while the Germans systematically destroyed him. He had flown 200 miles bleeding, partially blind, in a plane that should have crashed. That kind of experience scarred a man deeply. In his first days in the hospital, Robert had recurring nightmares. He would wake up sweating, hearing the crack, crack, crack of German cannons. He saw the FW-190 in every shadow. Doctors recognized symptoms of what we now call PTSD, but at the time was simply combat fatigue. They offered to put him on permanent bed rest to send him home. Robert refused. "I'm not finished yet," he told the chief physician. "I have a score to settle." It wasn't about revenge. Robert wasn't a vengeful man. It was about finishing the job, doing his part, not abandoning his squadmates when he could still contribute. After 2 weeks, he returned to flight status. His commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, legendary leader of the 56th Group, called him for a private meeting. "Bob," Zemke said, "you don't need to prove anything to anyone. What you survived out there is more than enough. Nobody would expect you to return to combat." "I want to fly, sir," Robert replied simply. Zemke studied him for a long time, then nodded. "You will fly, but let's start slowly. Routine patrols, nothing intense. If at any point you feel you can't continue, tell me. No shame in that." Robert returned to combat in July 1943. His first missions were difficult. Every time he saw FW-190s, his muscles tensed. Each burst of flak made him shudder involuntarily. He had to consciously force himself to remain calm, follow his training, and not let fear overwhelm him. But gradually his confidence returned. He remembered why he had become a fighter pilot. He rediscovered the joy of flying, the satisfaction of protecting bombers, the camaraderie of his squadron mates. The trauma didn't disappear. It never completely disappears, but he learned to manage it. And he began to accumulate victories. In August, he shot down 2 Bf-109s in combat. In September, he destroyed an FW-190, the same type of aircraft that had almost killed him. Each victory was a step beyond the trauma, proving to himself that he was still a capable pilot. October brought more victories. November 2. Robert developed a reputation as an exceptionally aggressive, but also extremely careful driver. He attacked when he had the advantage, retreated when he didn't. He fiercely protected his wingman, and he never, ever lost situational awareness again. In December 1943, Robert achieved ace status, 5 confirmed victories. It was a significant milestone. He continued adding to his total throughout 1944, 7 victories, 10, 15, 20. Each number represented deadly combat where he or the enemy would die. Each number was a life saved. A German pilot who would not shoot down bombers, would not kill any more Allied pilots. But Robert never forgot that June day. He carried physical scars, fine lines on his forehead and cheek where shrapnel had cut. And he carried deeper scars that no one saw. In interviews after the war, he was always humble about his accomplishments. "I was lucky," he would say. Lucky to have that plane under me. Lucky that the engineers had built something so robust. Lucky that the Germans ran out of ammunition or chose to let me go. But it wasn't just luck. It was exceptional skill, courage under extreme pressure, and an absolute refusal to give up when death seemed certain. Robert S. Johnson ended the war as the second highest scoring American ace in the European theater, with 27 confirmed aerial victories. Only Francis Gabby Gabreski, his squadron mate in the 56th Group, had more with 28. It was an extraordinary record. But Robert's true contribution went beyond numbers. His experience on June 26, 1943, became a case study in multiple aspects of aerial warfare. For pilots, it demonstrated that survival was possible even in seemingly hopeless situations. Never give up became a mantra in the 56th Group. Remember what Johnson survived and keep fighting. For engineers, the half-pint provided invaluable data on survivability design. Republic Aviation analyzed every aspect of why the aircraft had remained flyable despite massive damage. Several improvements were incorporated into later P-47s based directly on that analysis. The cockpit armor was reinforced. It was already substantial, but engineers saw where additional protection could have prevented some of Robert's injuries. Thicker armor plates were installed in critical areas. System redundancy was increased. The fact that Robert had lost virtually all hydraulic systems but still managed to lower the landing gear manually demonstrated the value of backups. More systems were given emergency manual capabilities. The self-sealing fuel tank protection proved its worth absolutely. Multiple punctures should have drained the tanks completely. Instead, seals worked, allowing Robert to fly home. Self-sealing tanks became standard on all subsequent fighter aircraft. The R-2800 radial engine gained an almost legendary reputation for indestructibility. The fact that it continued to generate power with half of its cylinders destroyed impressed even skeptical engineers. Radial engines became the preferred choice for ground attack aircraft and other roles where combat damage was expected. Robert's story also had a profound psychological impact on pilots. Knowing that someone had survived such massive damage gave them hope. In combat, when planes were hit, pilots remembered half-pint and kept fighting to get home. Multiple pilots later credited Robert's story with inspiring them not to abandon damaged planes. Half-pint itself, after extensive reconstruction, flew training missions for the remainder of the war. It was always pointed out to new pilots. This plane took over 200 hits and brought its pilot home, instructors would say. That's what the P-47 can do. That's what you're flying. Trust it. After the war, Robert returned to the United States as a hero. He received multiple decorations, including the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest American military decoration. But typical of his modest character, he rarely wore his medals and deflected credit for them. He worked as a test pilot for Republic Aviation for several years, helping to develop next-generation jets. He later became an executive in the aerospace industry. Eventually, he retired comfortably but never completely left aviation. He attended air shows, spoke to veterans groups, and wrote a memoir detailing his experiences. In interviews, Robert always returned to that day in June 1943. "It changed me," he admitted. "Confronting death so closely for so long, you don't come out of it the same. But it also taught me about resilience, human and mechanical. I learned that we can survive more than we think possible. That good design saves lives. That never giving up makes a difference." The original half-pint, after its reconstruction and training service, was eventually retired. Parts of it were preserved in museums. Sections of the fuselage showing damage patterns were used in educational displays for decades. The story of Robert S. Johnson and the half-pint resonates across decades because it embodies fundamental truths about engineering, human courage, and survival design that remain relevant today. For aerospace engineers, it remains a classic case study. Universities still teach about the P-47 in aircraft design courses. The principles that made the Thunderbolt so enduring, systems redundancy, pilot protection, robust airframe design, are incorporated into every modern military aircraft. The A-10 Warthog, a ground attack aircraft designed in the 1970s, traces a direct lineage back to the P-47's design philosophy. The decision to use radial engines instead of inline engines had lasting consequences. Radial engines were eventually replaced by jet engines, but the principle remained. Critical systems must be able to withstand damage and continue functioning. Modern military aircraft have massive redundancy. Multiple hydraulic systems, duplicated or triplicated flight computers, widely spaced engines so that a single hit cannot destroy them all. The self-sealing fuel tank protection developed for World War II aircraft has evolved into even more sophisticated systems. Modern tanks not only seal when punctured, but have inert nitrogen systems that prevent fuel from igniting. But the basic concept goes directly back to the tanks that saved Robert Johnson. For military pilots, the story remains inspiring. Every generation of aviators learns about Robert Johnson at some point in their training. The message is clear: never give up. Planes can survive unbelievable damage. Pilots can overcome severe injuries and trauma. Continuing to fight to get home is always worth it. The psychological aspect of the story should not be underestimated. PTSD in combat veterans is now recognized and treated seriously. Robert's experience, facing severe trauma but successfully returning to combat, demonstrates that recovery is possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. For the general public, the story is a reminder of sacrifices made by previous generations. Robert Johnson was a 23-year-old from Oklahoma who could have had a comfortable life at home. Instead, he chose to fly into combat, faced death multiple times, was seriously wounded, but continued to serve. He and his generation defeated tyranny through courage, sacrifice, and determination. The story also celebrates exceptional engineering design. The Republic aviation engineers who designed the P-47 never flew in combat, but their work saved thousands of lives. Every design decision that prioritized survivability over marginal performance, every ounce of armor added, every backup system installed, it all added up to create an aircraft that could bring pilots home. Robert S. Johnson lived until 1998, passing away at the age of 78. He saw aviation evolve from propeller-driven P-47s to supersonic jets and beyond. He saw design principles that saved his life incorporated into successive generations of aircraft. And he saw his story inspire countless pilots and engineers. At his funeral, former P-47 pilots, now in their 70s and 80s, came from all over the country to pay their respects. They shared stories of how Robert's experience had inspired them, how knowing that someone had survived the impossible had given them courage when their own planes were shot down. A veteran pilot summed it up perfectly. Bob Johnson taught us two things. First, that the P-47 was an incredible plane that could bring you home no matter what. Second, that the human spirit is even more indestructible. Bob could have given up at any moment on that hellish flight. He could have abandoned it. He could have quit. But he didn't. He kept fighting, kept flying, kept believing he would survive. And he did. Today, more than 80 years after that day in June 1943, the story remains powerful. It remains relevant. Because we still need examples of courage under extreme pressure. We still need reminders that good design saves lives. And we still need stories that demonstrate that the impossible is sometimes just difficult. Robert S. Johnson and his indestructible P-47 will continue to inspire as long as people value courage, exceptional engineering, and the triumph of the human spirit over impossible circumstances.